So it's the first time that I give a talk like this on Zoom, so we will see how it goes. So I thought I would take things slowly and have rather a conversational tone, telling you a little bit the story of this book and how I came to write it and why I wrote it. And also what use you could make of this book, okay? So it's really a window in the world of academia. Those of you, since you are, I presume a large number of you are first gen, as you are entering the world of higher education, it's a world toward which you may feel that you have a certain distance. So the subtitle of the book is Inside the Curious World of Academic Judgment. And the reason I wrote this book is when I became full professor at Princeton in 2000, I was still pretty young, and I'm French Canadian, and I had done my graduate work in France, and I had gone to Stanford as a postdoc before taking a first job at UT Austin and then moving to Princeton, and I went through the ranks. And I felt very much that as a young faculty member, no one had provided me information about how people make decisions about evaluating my work. And I kind of felt that this was unfair. I thought it was an unfair advantage for those who had parents who were university professors or who had parents who were operating in the world of research. So then I felt like, okay, I'm an outsider in some ways, because I was not produced by the system to which I had joined. And I could look at it a little bit through lenses that were quite unlike other people's lenses, because I did not take for granted the way that American higher education functions, having been socialized in the Canadian and then the French system before moving to the US. So I was a sociologist of knowledge from the very beginning of my intellectual trajectory. I had studied political philosophy, which is an important thing because one of the things that the book does is really discuss the culture of various disciplines. And it tries to make the familiar strange by juxtaposing how, for instance, philosophers and economists evaluate work and determine that it is good. So as a political philosopher, I had studied something called epistemology, which is the science of knowing. How do we know that we know? What is the relationship between the person who examines reality and that reality? And, the question of where excellence resides is really a question of epistemology. So what do I mean by that? In some disciplines, for instance, economics, they have a conception that knowledge is objectively true or good, independently of the eye of the beholder. The quality is not in the eye of the beholder. The quality is in the grant proposal itself. Either it's good or it's not good. The kind of evaluation that I study occurs in deliberation panels. That is, I've looked at 5 different national competitions that gives money to people to do research. And these panels bring together people from a range of disciplines. Before deliberating, before being brought together, typically in a windowless room in central Manhattan, to compare a bunch of proposals that people have already read, they spend a lot of time at home ranking the proposals themselves. So to tell you how it works, let's say if I'm asked to serve on the panel of the American Council for Learned Societies, they will ask me, let's say in September, and then I can put this in my calendar, and then I know that in January I will receive 75 proposals, and I need to read them, and they give me a set of criteria. So the criteria are often things like originality, feasibility, significance, so both intellectual significance, how important is the project, and social significance, how much is it gonna matter for society. Feasibility is whether or not the person who submits the proposal is equipped to do the research project. So these people are sitting in their living room for many evenings before flying to Manhattan to deliberate and compare their ratings. And they evaluate each of the proposals along these criteria, but there's both official criteria, which are the one that I just gave you, but there's also unofficial criteria. So, and this is for you guys as you are learning to apply for fellowships, that's really, really important, because I know my graduate students don't often understand that clarity in writing is probably the most important criteria. If the proposal is not super carefully crafted, if the writing is not really like fluid and clear and flawless, you're going to be thrown out right away. Why? Because these people who are sitting in their living room have literally big piles to go through. And if they have to work really hard to understand what you mean, they get very impatient and they say, no, wait, that's a loser. So they are not selecting the best proposal as much as, you know, if they have 75 proposals and they need to select 10 that will be among the finalists, they're mostly deselecting. They're mostly looking for reasons to not keep the proposals, right? So, among the informal criteria, the criteria that are not necessarily spelled out, you have that. You have criteria having to do with diversity that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Criteria that have to do with how you are capable of connecting theory and data, and that varies a lot across the discipline and how it is done. For instance, anthropology wants much more theory than, let's say, political science. So you, as you are preparing yourself to become to go to the university, you become familiar with what's the difference between these disciplines and how they approach knowledge production. So when I said earlier that, you know, the question of where does the quality reside, is it in the proposal itself or in the eye of the beholder? What happened is, as people are assembled, typically for 2 days, they go through, you know, before meeting in Manhattan, they all send in their ratings that they gave to each proposal. And that's how the long shortlist is created. And they may end up with, let's say, 40 proposals that will be discussed in depth. The other ones are not going to be discussed because they didn't make the next round. And they each take notes on what are they view as the strengths and the weaknesses. And then they have to convince each other that, you know, their evaluation is the correct one. So, and the proposals don't speak for themselves. You need to have someone who will step up and defend the proposal, right? I mean, there are some proposals that are barely discussed because they got top ratings from everyone. The proposals that get ones from everyone, that's not an issue. They're not even discussed. But there's always a large number of proposals that are good or very good, but they have flaws. So a lot of what the evaluators do then is to try to deliberate amongst themselves about which flaws are most important, which one are fatal, how should people be ranked, and that's where criteria of diversity come in. Okay? And these criteria of diversity, when I started the project, I thought they would mostly be concerned with ethno-racial or gender diversity, but not at all. The main kinds of diversity that they were interested in were institutional diversity, which means that if they were to give all the money to people who teach in Ivy League universities or East Coast universities or R1 universities are research universities such as Berkeley, UCLA, Michigan. They don't have to be private at all, but they're the leading research university in the country. If they were only to fund such universities or students who are in those universities, the competition wouldn't work in the sense that it would be viewed as not meritocratic. There is the notion that cream rises, and that cream rises from all corners of the country and from all kinds of institutions. So I remember, for instance, for this project, I was able to interview a large number of people, well, 80-some people from a range of discipline, a few minutes after they had finished their deliberation. So I would ask them to describe to me, and I had the rankings that had been produced collectively before the meeting. I would ask them, you know, let's say this woman who was at the beginning of the deliberations ranked pretty low when she got funded, what kind of arguments did you make in favor or against it? And what kind of argument did the geographer or the law professor make in favor or against this person? So explain to me why she was chosen, you know, what were the strengths? So that's what the deliberation is about. People who are in a situation where they spend 2 days together in a room, where they have to try to convince others that their opinion of these proposals are the correct one. And that's really important when I say that their opinion, because in fact, these people are all experts in the sense that they all have PhDs, they are all leading scholars in their field. They accept to do this additional work. It's additional because their normal day job is to teach, to do research, to supervise their graduate students, to serve on committees in their department. Well, that work, they know they'll have to do it during the evening or during the weekends when they would maybe rather spend time with their kids. So it's an additional burden. And why do they do it? Well, they do it in part because it resonates with their self-concept, their image as experts whose opinion is valued and who are respected by others. When the organization that sponsors the competition, let's say Mellon Mays, the Mellon Foundation is one of the main foundations that supports research in the humanities, and you guys, you may apply for Mellon Mays fellowship at some point. Well, they approach these scholars by saying, would you please serve on this competition to evaluate the proposal? We really trust your judgments and we need you. And then if people feel like they themselves have been supported in the past, like I have several students who are former Mellon Mays scholars, well, they will say yes, in part because they're grateful, but also they feel an obligation to help people behind them. So that's how academics end up being really overworked, because they give back. But they are proud of being asked, and they want their opinion to be respected by other people in the room. So the question of whether or not when they leave after 2 days of deliberation, they want to feel like they did well, that they were able to convince others that their judgment was good, and they create alliances. So the original title of the book, I'll show you the book, I don't know if you were able to see it, How Professors Think Inside the Curious World of Academic Judgment. So it was published by Harvard University Press in 2009. So it's already a pretty old book. It's 10 years old, but it's still a book that is widely read. I'm gonna go to Australia this summer to give a talk on gender in peer review, because the people there have read this book. And the person who invited me is a philosopher. So it's a book that has been read across a number of disciplines for a reason that I'll explain in a minute. But the original title of the book was Cream Rising. Why? Because a lot of the interviewees, as I was talking to them, they kept saying that cream rises, as if quality is naturally recognized by people. And I have a lot of quotes, I can recognize it when I see it. I know it's good. It's hard to spell out what it is. And my job as an interviewer was really to try to get them to spell out how they know that something is, to make it very explicit. And in the book, if you read it, have you read any of the book? Say yes if you have. Yes? Okay, good. So you know what I'm talking about, what kind of quotes I'm talking about. They will say, well, it was the most original proposal. And then I would say, what do you mean by originality? And then they would say, well, it opened new vistas. It opened new questions that have never been asked before. So I wrote a separate paper after writing the book titled Originality Across the Social Sciences and the Humanities, which is precisely to show that the way people think about originality varies a lot across disciplines. So many more anthropologists, for instance, think of originality as giving voice to underrepresented groups. And that is also the case in English, bringing new data, finding a new unknown or under-recognized, let's say, Native American writer and bringing him to the public will become a form of contribution that is viewed as deeply original. That doesn't happen as much in sociology or political science. So you have different kinds of excellence. And one of the ideas that keep coming back in this book is that different types of knowledge shine under different lights. So if you take a course in economics or a course in anthropology, you will see that they have you read papers and books that are really, really different from each other. And the anthropologists typically will have really detailed description that try to convey adequately the vision of the world of the individuals that they're talking to, so that we can understand where they're coming from. Economists will never do that. They value formalization of knowledge. They will use equation to try to describe social relationships. They want to reduce relationships to things that can be put in mathematical form. So their understanding of originality is really almost incompatible with that of anthropologists. Yet many of the organizations that fund the work of researchers and graduate students have multidisciplinary panels. So as students, you need to be able to learn to write proposals that will be convincing to people from different disciplines. So, there's a lot of tips that I can give you on how to do this. And I think the chapters that would be most important for you in the book would be the chapter on the criteria of evaluation. What do they mean when they say social significance? Social significance in relation to the transformation of social relationship, empowerment of underrepresented groups, enlightening, shedding light on relationships of exploitation, showing how the government is, maintaining groups in a state of subordination, on and on and on. You have to think what kind of social change can be produced by the research that is being proposed. Intellectual significance simply has to do with the kind of conversation that are happening in disciplines and what is the current knowledge about the topic. So in this case, proposal would position the argument or the hypothesis that the scholar wants to make in relation to the current literature. And it would criticize the current literature and say, these people are wrong because they underestimate X or Y. In my analysis, I'm going to gather data that will show that this factor that they've always overlooked is really crucial to understand phenomenon X. Okay, so these are very different kinds of arguments for why research matters, but a lot of our graduate students apply for graduate funding from the National Science Foundation, and when they ask people to evaluate their proposal, there's two criteria that are presented to them: intellectual significance and social significance. But in fact, the vast majority of proposals, and of papers for that matter, are excluded because of the theoretical framework. I have a friend who teaches at Cornell who was able to gain access to all the papers that were published in a journal, an important business school journal called Administrative Science Quarterly. And he asked the authors of these papers to give him both the original version of the paper that they submitted and all the reviews that they received from the evaluators. And they were able to compare the reviews, what they were being told to change, and what was the published paper like. And they discover in this paper, his name is David Strang, S-T-R-N-G, teaches in the Sociology department at Cornell. They found out that the vast majority of the suggestions and comments that they received from the reviewers had to do with the first 5 to 10 pages. It's the theoretical framework that counts most. How do you position yourself in relation to the ongoing discussion in your field, and also how you connect the theory, what you want to demonstrate, with the data? What kind of data do you use to do so? So this transposed to your puzzle that's ahead of you: how do I write a really good dissertation, or sorry, not a dissertation, a fellowship proposal if you want to apply for Mellon Mays? Well, you have to come up with an idea that has not been researched to death. Something that you may be able to say something new about. And why would that be new? Well, you can think about questions that about which you feel like you have some intuitive sense about because of your own life experience, or a topic that you've gained real interest about and where you've spent a lot of time reading around it. And yeah, you want to draw on your experience to find a question that is really meaningful to you. So, okay, so I'll step back a little bit and tell you a little more about the research project that led to the book. So I gained access to 5 national competitions. One is the Social Science Research Council gives money for people who want to write dissertations that involve comparative analysis. So let's say Peru and Mexico, and immigrants to the US from these 2 countries. What kind of trajectory? What brings them to the US? How do they get there? What's the role of chain migration? That is, you know, your family or your place of origin, and giving you the context you need to be able to actually go through the immigration process. How different is the immigration experience for male and females given their insertion in the job market? So that's the kind of questions that this competition will support. So I was able to observe people who serve on these competitions. So not only did I interview them after their deliberation, but I was able to spend a few days with them, observing how they were trying to convince each other of the value of their perspective. And in my interview schedule, my list of questions I used after during my interview, I had questions such as, can you describe to me the worst panelists there? Who made the most mistake? Who, in your view, performed their role the worst? And I remember one person in particular, everyone hated him. He was an anthropologist. And why did people not respect him? Because they perceived him as extremely argumentative, and also because he had a very, very narrow view of what was good. So one of the things that's happening in anthropology now is that people are doing multi-site studies. That is, instead of going to spend 9 months in a village, you know, in Guatemala, they will instead, you know, go to 3 different villages, you know. So it's something that is now very widely respected. Well, he was just trashing everything, and he was super argumentative. So he did not present himself in a way that met the expectations. So there's a moral dimension that is super important and that the literature doesn't talk about. The panelists among themselves have expectations about what would be a good panelist. And that self that they value is not only about cognition, it's not only about what they know, their expertise, but it's also about their demeanor in relation to other panelists, which they believe these panels should function like a deliberative democracy, which means that everyone has the same weight in the deliberation. The old Harvard professor is not supposed to try to push his way around and bully people so that he gets his outcome. Instead, if there is a, you know, a much younger person from a lower prestige university, he's supposed to really engage with her, and it's a rational approach in the sense that they're supposed to convince each other. So that's why we say it's deliberative. It's through deliberation that people convince each other of the value of their perspective. And you have in the room people who are of very different disciplines, so they may not have the same criteria of evaluation. So there are cases where people really get upset. So I mentioned in the book the case of a philosophy professor who didn't want to have lunch with the other panelists because he felt like he had been bullied. Why did he feel bullied? Because his approach to philosophy was super conservative and traditional. And you had a couple of women who felt like he was pushing what is called a universalistic perspective. Like if, you know, there was you know, how would I say this? He did not appreciate the relativity of the world in which the people that were being discussed lived. He had like a view of, it's called view from nowhere, you know, a view that there were values that were good in and of themselves. And these women felt like he was totally out of it. So he felt very disrespected because a proposal from philosophy, and he was a philosopher, did not get funded despite his opinion. Normally more weight is put on the opinion of the person from the discipline. So he felt really disrespected. But that speaks to, who's the worst panelist? Well, he's one of the people that others singled out as a bad panelist because he was, he felt very much that his perspective should, be the dominant one. So they learned to present themselves to act with a lot of respect. So here I'm using a very specific concept that comes from sociology. There's a guy who taught for a long time at UCLA named Garfinkel, who created something called Ethnomethodology, and he would send his students home and tell them to break all the rules of everyday interaction. For instance, you walk into an elevator and you stand next to the person who's already there, 3 inches between his nose and your nose, and you stare at them. Well, you're obviously breaking the unspoken rule of interaction, which is that you maintain a certain physical distance toward others and you ignore each other, more or less, in a context such as an elevator. Or he would send the students home and say at night, interact with your parents as if they were perfect strangers. So that's also, again, what we call a breaching experiment. You behave in a way that violates the shared understood rule of interaction. So this applies to my study to the extent that I started also interviewing these 80-some people about who was breaking the rules. So by looking at who was described as breaking the rules, I was able to see what were the rules. The breaking of the rules made the rule evident because they were explaining to me why they thought this person's behavior was unacceptable. I'll give you 2 other examples of things that were viewed as unacceptable. One of them is the use of self-interest. So I'm only going to try to push my students and the students of my friends. So this is really viewed as a no-no because it's anti-meritocracy. Of course it happens, but you're not supposed to do it in a way that is very conspicuous or evident. So, some of if you look at chapter 4, I think it's called Pragmatic Fairness, Customary Rules of Deliberation. That's what I describe in that chapter. And I identify the rules by looking at who they think has broke the rules and why they've broken the rules. So the guy, for instance, who shamelessly pushes his students, although everyone knows it is his students, when your student is being discussed, you're supposed to recuse yourself. If you don't recuse yourself, it destroys the legitimacy of the panel, right? The whole thing is based in a faith in meritocracy. And all these people engage in a lot of things to maintain their collective faith that cream rises. If people are destroying this, then they will think, why don't we just stand at the top of a staircase and throw the proposal down the staircase and give the money to those who land furthest, they really want to believe that how knowledge is produced matters. And they do all kinds of things to ensure that. Another example of someone who violated the customary rule is the people who engage in idiosyncratic criteria. So this woman who said, I'm a dancer, I really like dance. That's why I really pushed this one because I just like dance. So that's about her personal taste. And, she should not say, I'm simply pushing it because I love dance. She should make an argument about the proposal based on the inherent quality of the proposal. So, this is how we see that, and this is just a small microcosm of what academic life is about. But, it's a world where people really spend an awful lot of time producing good, going out of their way to produce knowledge that is that they believe will stand the test of time. I'll give you one example of this so that you can understand how deep this is. I have a graduate student. I just approved her qualifying paper yesterday. Qualifying paper is like the master's paper. And for it, she went to Spain and interviewed a whole bunch of young people who have been victim of the 2008 recession in Spain. And they were college graduate, but they found themselves without a job. And because they don't have a job, they cannot leave their parents' house, and they cannot have babies, and they cannot live with their partner. So she was interested in how they project themselves into the future. So their projected self. And she found that many of them hold to the notion that everything will be okay, that since they have a college degree, they just have to wait, and at some point something will work out. And she has something like 60 respondents. But so she took all that data and she coded the interviews. And because she did extremely exhaustive job coding everything, the end of the paper discusses the 8 people she interviewed who don't fit the pattern. And as I was giving her comments on her paper, because the next step for her is to try to publish it, I said, the fact that you're so thorough in examining your evidence, it will really help you to publish the paper, because you demonstrate that you did not leave any leaf unturned. And that's really the mark of, exhaustive research. And that's the kind of thing that people engage in all the time. So when it comes to you writing your proposal, although you are undergrads and you're looking for support for your research, that's basically the world that you are writing for. People who really value thoroughness and attention to details. In order to deliver this kind of work, it means that you cannot start writing the proposal a week before the deadline. You have to start it a month ahead, and then you have time to return to it and to make sure that there's no typos, and to really have time to maybe show it to some of your friends or professor who will give you feedback on it, so that you can really bring it to the right level. Because, to evaluate you, they will have access to your transcripts and other things. But for them to, if you think about the piece of paper is a reflection of your mind, they want to see how clearly you're able to think and how clearly you're able to formulate questions. So, and for me, it's very much like I'm teaching right now a course in qualitative methods, which is basically interviewing. And I tell the students, it's like, I call it the Jane Fonda principle, which is like, you need to exercise the same muscle many, many times for it to become stronger. And similarly, in your own writing, you just need to exercise the same muscles of, writing clearly and making sure that you're connecting, that there's a clear connection between your hypotheses and the data you want to collect to answer the question that you want to pursue. And, you kind of practice doing this, and the more you do it, the more likely you're capable of doing it well. So wait a minute, I'll drink some Coke. Okay, so my methodology, the five organization I studied, there was the Social Science Research Council. I told you about that competition. There's something called the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship for Women, which gives money to graduate students who want to do research on a topic related to gender. There was something called the American Council for Learned Societies that gives money to professors when they want to go on sabbatical to write a book. So, and then there was one of the Ivy League schools have something called the Society of Fellows, and those competitions are crazy in the sense that you have 800 people applying for 2 spots. And then there's also a private foundation that supports the social sciences. So these organizations don't support undergrad, but I think the ideas behind what I'm describing to you applies across the board. So for instance, at Harvard, there is Mel and May competition, and the faculty who are, asked to help out with this competition, who will evaluate the proposals, are people, who do evaluation all the time. A lot of what we do is evaluation. And all this is free in the sense that the university pays us a salary, but, it's kind of professionalism, like you do it just because you're asked to do it, and it's your turn to give back. So I had these 5 organizations. I studied the panels for 2 years. So I had a total of 10 panels. It was really difficult to convince the organizations to give me access, because everything that concerns peer review is considered confidential, because people's performance is discussed publicly. So they were concerned about that. And I went through something called the Institutional Review Board. All universities have that. It's an office in universities that ensure that the human subject are treated fairly and respectfully. So I had a protocol, and I asked people who I was going to interview to sign it. And I said, this is all confidential. I'm not going to use your name. If there are identifying information, I will camouflage it so that no one can, like if I'm interviewed and I say in the interview, my book, How Professors Think, well, people can easily find me. So I would have changed the title of the book. And I said, there are questions, if you don't want to answer them, you just don't answer them. And I also was able to do observation. So that was the data, okay? And when I started the project, I mostly wanted to understand how people do peer review, but then a lot of other questions that I had not anticipated came up, which is why we call it research, right? You don't know what will happen once you start. And like this question of the self and of morality that I just mentioned to you, who's a good panelist, who respects the rules, who breaks the rules, the fact that they think of themselves as experts and they want to walk out of there after 2 days feeling they've been respected. All this has to do with the self of the academics, of the evaluators. And the previous literature on peer review totally ignored the self. It pretended that it did not exist. The major people in this old guy named Robert Merton, who was one of the main sociologists of science in the United States for a very long time, they just bracketed the self. Their whole approach was to demonstrate that the self of the evaluators really didn't matter, that cream rise, that the best research was always, rewarded, which is frankly a very idealistic view. It's not that everything is corrupt. Like we just had this huge scandal, right, about admission. If you just look at this, you will think the whole world of higher education is corrupt. This is like, a demonstration of moment where the system really fails, but in a daily functioning of the 4,000 universities that exist in the United States, there's a lot of people who every day try to abide by the rules of academia, which are meritocratic rules, which is why like your teachers are going to spend time, trying to grade you fairly, etc. Just as in this book, people are trying to do everything fairly. So I decided to study the social sciences and the humanities, while a lot of the literature on peer review is on the STEM discipline. And having started in political philosophy, I was really interested in looking at the difference between the more empirical disciplines, which are the disciplines that use a lot of data, sociology, economics, political science, and the humanities. English, for instance, they use text, but they are not constrained by data the way that empirical researchers are, or philosophy. And I thought, how do they go? What's the difference, in how they go about evaluating? So the second chapter of the book is about the disciplinary cultures. And it's the third one. It's called On Disciplinary Cultures. And there's a second chapter is called How Panel Works, which is what I described to you earlier about deliberation and people reading at home and then coming together to deliberate. Well, the disciplinary cultures are really different. Like in economics, they believe that the quality is in the proposal itself and that you can objectively rank all the proposals in an order, and that you're going to have a really high level of consensus about which one are best and which one are worse. Whereas in disciplines that are more influenced by what we call the interpretive turn, I don't know if you've read people like Michel Foucault, or there's been a whole bunch of authors that created post-structuralism. These are disciplines where there's far less agreement about knowledge, and where they think that the cream rises because people speak on behalf of. You need to have someone in the room who will give voice to your proposal, because your proposal, even if it's good, cannot speak for itself. You need a defender, essentially. And you need alliances in the room that will lead people to be more able to convince others. So, but these alliances are also a little bit illicit in the sense that you're not supposed to always side, you know, like you always help me out, you always vote like me, and then I'll always vote like you. This would be viewed as a travesty, as negating how the system should work. So instead, I cite one guy in particular. One of my questions in the interview schedule was, there are sometimes people in a panel toward whom you feel a little bit closer, whose judgment you respect more. Can you describe to me what this person is? And then the guy, who I think was a historian, goes on to describe someone in comparative literature as someone who had exquisite taste, because she always had the same opinion as me. So in his words, when he says that, you know, he thinks what he's saying is the truth. He truly believes that this person is really smart. And he describes to me an alliance, but it's not thought by him and by others as something that's corrupted. It's just like, you know, he pays and he says, when she makes an argument, I pay special attention because I know that what she's going to say is really meaningful. So that's how a culture of a panel, you know, takes shape, and which influences the outcome and who gets the money. So, so basically what I'm telling you is there's questions such as, you know, the construction of merit that ended up being really, really central to the book, which didn't mean to be central when I started. So the chapter on there's a chapter on interdisciplinarity and diversity, and that will interest those of you who are particularly interested in knowing how much are these universities fair. So as I said earlier, when I started the book, the focus on diversity really was supposed to be about race and gender, but they right away started talking about institutional diversity. So not only Ivy League universities should get money, but also, importantly, geographic diversity. That, you know, someone who teaches in a small liberal arts in Colorado should really be given a break. So if you have two proposals that are roughly ranked at the same level, remember here we're not talking about the proposal that everyone agrees on, that have received ones from everyone, because these proposals don't even get discussed. We're talking about the proposals that have little weaknesses. Well, they may put next to each other two proposals that have small weaknesses, but similar or different weaknesses. And if there's one that comes from the person who is at the community college, let's say, the person will be chosen over the other one. Why? Because it reinforces the idea of meritocracy, because you end up with a pool that is more diverse. Diverse not necessarily in ethno-racial terms, but diverse in terms of maximizing the chances of success for a large number of people. It doesn't always happen, but it's an argument that I saw happening again and again. So the kind of diversity that they're most concerned with were institutional, geographic, and disciplinary diversity. The historians write like God, and they would always get all the fellowships because they write so well. And what they write is of general interest, so it's not overly specialized often, although the topics may often seem quite narrow. But they don't want to end up with a list of winners where 85% of people are historians. So that's where, for instance, if you are a geographer or a philosopher, there you get a small plus. So it's really them putting, you know, their thumb on the scale to ensure that the final outcome is as diverse as possible. And interdisciplinarity, so that's complicated. For instance, if some of you are interested in, let's say, ethnic studies. Ethnic studies is a deeply multidisciplinary field, which is both social science and humanities. And that's true of communication, it's true of, you know, business, it's true of education. All these interdisciplinary fields face challenges because often to succeed, people need to meet a high bar set not by one discipline, but by several disciplines. And the canonization of the criteria through which quality is defined is in the process of being formulated for many of these subfields. So they are consequently perceived as of lesser quality. by people who are in the traditional discipline. So I argue in the book that those who do interdisciplinarity often face double jeopardy because they need to, show that they're above the bar, not to one audience, one discipline, but to two. And it's really sometimes quite difficult to do this. So I've covered a lot of things. I think I've spoken for almost 45 minutes now. So let me think a little bit. Another question that David has asked me to address is, what are the implications and recommendation for undergraduates who are interested in applying? So I think, number one, you would need to understand a little bit the world in which you're going to be trying to function by sending in your proposal. And probably the most important thing is to not eliminate yourself. That is, if you don't apply, you'll never get the money. If you want money, you have to apply time and 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 time again. So I'll give you one example of one of my graduate students who went to UNC, and she was first gen, and she figured out that she could travel the world by being at this University of North Carolina. And indeed, she spent time in Turkey and in Australia and in Namibia. She found all the travel opportunities that she could get access through by doing research, by applying to the Office of International Affairs and the Office of this and that. So you should consider, plus it's really fun, right, to travel. So you should consider, as you are considering where to apply, to look also what kind of support do they give to students to facilitate your work, or do they make money available? Like, let's say if you want to write a senior thesis. I have a daughter who's just finishing this semester at Berkeley, and she was able to spend the month of January in Turkey to do, interviews in Istanbul on human trafficking. And that's a case where she just got to 3,000, but it was enough to cover all her expenses. And it gives you a really interesting, she started at UCLA and she then transferred. So it gives you really interesting experiences. And then later when you go on the job market, these are the kind of experiences that really puts you in a different category. And I think if you are particularly interested in applying for the Mellon Mays program, I've advised several students who are part of it, it's made to attract students of color who may be like much more tempted to go to fields where you make a lot of money, like law or business, toward academia. Because, we face a problem of leaking pipeline. The more students can have mentors and professors who look like themselves and who have had experiences similar to theirs, the more they're likely to succeed, because then the message that the institutions send them about who belongs is a much more powerful one. If you are a university where, everyone looks the same, everyone is white middle class, then it's much harder to believe that you belong. But right now there's a large number of universities, including the top universities like Harvard, that are making a lot of money available for first generation. And you may want to check out the book of one of my graduate students who's now teaching here, Anthony Jack. He wrote a book titled The Privileged Poor, where he studies first-gen students who have come to an Ivy League university and how they navigate the university and what they do to succeed and not succeed, and how does the university penalizes them by not fully recognizing the challenges that they encounter. But the book just came out a month ago, but it was a dissertation before. And as he was working on the dissertation, the institution changed a lot of its practices, like, keeping the cafeterias open during spring break so that low-income students wouldn't have to go back to their family for the spring break, or, a number of things. So it's partly him teaching universities how they, maybe out of ignorance, make things difficult for students who come from lower income families. So, and I can tell you I'm now 61. I've spent my whole life in academia. don't eliminate yourself is something you need to remember all the time. It requires a lot of resilience. If you don't get turned down for a thing, it's because you don't apply for things, because everyone gets turned down all the time. And that's a message that I spend a lot of time teaching my 3 kids, you know, like you just have to put yourself out there. And in the process of doing it, you also develop your skills and you improve from one paper and one proposal to the other. But you should also really, Tony Jack's book, The Privileged Poor, shows how the students who have gone through Prep for Success programs know how important it is to reach out to faculty, to ask for advice, to go to office hours. It can be a really interesting book for you to read because it really shows what the kids who have been mentored take for granted. Yes, you are supposed to go to office hours. Going to office hours is not something optional. You just need to figure out in your environment all the resources that are available to you and, you know, use them as much as you can. And those who don't use those resources, they penalize themselves unwittingly. So the idea there is that you need a lot of resilience, but the institutional context in which you live and your peers and your broader family network, you know, you have to think in terms of who are the people who are giving you the tools to develop your capacities as much as possible. Where does resilience come from? It's by developing a kind of mentoring network. It's not one person, it's many people. You turn toward one person to get advice about, you know, editing your paper, toward another person about how to combine, you know, the work-study balance, etc. So, and as for translating lessons from my book to what you should do to have good grant proposals, I think lesson number 1 is really clarity in the writing. It has to be polished. You had, you know, like, I'm not talking about 2 drafts or 3 drafts. I'm talking about many drafts until when you read it, it feels like it's seamless, you know, and that's just a skill that you can learn. And I think many community colleges have writing centers where you can go and ask for feedback, or you can do peer-to-peer editing and ask people you're close to read your stuff, and vice versa. And this way you can help each other. And I would say, I don't know how much you've been able to do it yet, but I suggest you read my book, not to be self-promotional, but because it will help you understand this world that you may want to function in one day. And you may want to read other books on universities, you know. There's a book that just came out by a guy who teaches at UC Riverside. His name is Stephen Brint, and it's a book on the current state of American higher education. He is also the co-author of the best book on community colleges with another guy named Jerome Carabell. So Carabell and Brint is a book on community colleges that I would really urge you to read, because then it might help you better understand, you know, the strengths and the weaknesses of community colleges and how they compare with universities. So, you know, I would say try to really understand the environment in which you function, and that will help you gain a sense of control. That should also translate into more faith in your capacity to beat the odds and to, you know, propulse yourself and avail yourself of the resources that are out there for you. So I don't know, I don't know. I think I may have addressed most of the questions here. David, is David there?
David's out right now, but we have about 16 minutes for questions. Okay. If anyone has any, raise your hand and I'll come to you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for what you're doing. I'm a student in a community college, and I want to do research. I'm very interested. Unfortunately, at community colleges, professors are not interested in research. They're educators, but they don't see themselves as researchers. And that's the main difference between a college and a four-year university, for we understand that. what are my chances? How can I cross that ceiling to become a researcher in an environment that does not provide the resources?
Yeah.
Maybe insight into that?
Yeah. Well, you may want to explore whether your community college has programs that allows you to take courses in a university. So I know that there's in the California system literally tons of people who take advantage of the transfer program from community college to four-year colleges. I know that in part because my daughter went to UCLA, and when she transferred from UCLA to Berkeley, something like 98% of the people who were transferring with her were from community colleges. And just around me, I know I can give you a couple of names if you want, just to be inspired. There's a guy named Rene Flores, who is on the faculty at University of Chicago, who transferred from a community college to Berkeley as an undergrad, and he's now on the faculty at University of Chicago. There's a lot of stories like this. So I would really look into that. Are you aware of this program, the transfer program from community college to the UC system in California?
I am, and I'm looking into it, but it's going to take me some time before I can transfer. And meanwhile, I wanted to get involved into research.
Okay. Maybe you could talk to some of your professors to see if they know people in the area. I mean, frankly, the easiest way to get started, if you can afford this, you can simply go to see someone and say, I just want to work with you on your project, and if they don't have money to pay you, you can say, I'll do it on a voluntary basis, like 5 hours a week to start, just to get a sense of it. And once you have a little experience as a research assistant, then other people may hire you and pay you. There's also the work study program. The federal work study program gives you, faculty are able to hire students, and the students simply work in exchange for their financial aid. And that's a program that all faculty like to take advantage of, because it gives them research assistant without, having to have grants to support them. So
would professors hire research assistants from outside the universities, from outside the environment?
Well, what you would need to do, if you have a professor who himself has, I don't know, like maybe gone to graduate school with other people who are teaching in nearby schools, and he would recommend you to them, that would help. Or you can also, I mean, frankly, what do you have to lose, right? You could look at the web page of the departments in your field, in the region where you are, and try to spot people whose research seems interesting to you. And you can, I mean, what do you lose? You can write to them and say, I'm currently at this community college, but I'm really passionate by research. I find it super interesting. And I'm exploring whether anyone would be interested in having me as an intern or hiring me. I know every summer we get here in my department, like people who are just volunteering to work for us for the summer, I mean, we have graduate students who we have to hire first, they have priority. So, but you won't know until you try it, so.
Sure. That gives me some direction, yeah. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Does anyone else have a question? We have 10 minutes. Yeah, very.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I am from my name is Albert Tass. I have a doctoral degree about security strategies and management from Police Academy, from another country, that's Turkey, the Republic of Turkey. And I'm an immigrant in the US, nearly 5 years. I live in New York, Ohio, Los Angeles right now. I'm applying the postdoctoral fellowships at few university in the US, because just a few university has a program, center or study about security, like at Yale, Harvard Medical School, MIT Security Studies Department, Ohio State University Immersion Center, Stanford University Chase-Sat. Some universities has a center about security or conflict resolution, but they have an opportunity for postdoctoral or teaching. But mostly I got negative answers in these 5 years. I'm doing underemployment job sometimes as a security officer, and I always come across problem with ethnic, minority, racism, lots of things. That's very interesting. Is there any chance I can get a form about my research from another, not only university, but another sources, a fund, a private fund? My studies about accountability and oversight of the security institutions. My expertise about this, but I would like to work about the international security studies of the United States, especially post 9/11. Mostly I'm sending the universities under this title, but I'm getting negative answers. I don't want to work for the, because I'm coming from Turkey, so I don't want to work just about Turkey. I know some people, about their gender or about their ethnicity background. They are offering like those kind of things. If somebody coming from Greece, they offer relations between Greece and US or those kind of purposes. I don't want to work like this. I want to work for something. I'm paying tax. I want to add something to this country. Is there any chance other than university I can get a phone? Because I haven't any school from US. My oldest school from Turkey. I tried one school, Los Angeles Film School, but I couldn't pay it because there's a demand, unfortunately. And my age, 40. I don't want to take another PhD. Yeah, I can apply for PhD, but I don't want to take this another 40 or 5 years. Is there an opportunity I can take a fund for my research other than universities? Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know, for me to give you a real answer, I would need to know a lot about your file, about your transcript, about your past experience. In general, you kind of have to enter a PhD program to do research, and doing a BA and a senior thesis puts you on the path of doing that. So as far as I know, I cannot think of any other path, and the more you go toward the very top of the academic system, the more difficult it is. So, like in my department, the graduate program, we get 400 applications and we take 12. So one of the people we accepted this year is from Turkey, and she's a demographer interested in, I was not in the committee, so I don't know why they decided to accept her. But all this to say, sometimes it's quite, unpredictable. But, if you didn't have any luck to this year, I mean, you could consider this transfer program that I was just talking about, and then try to get into any of the UC system schools, because they're all excellent. And each of them have a Department of Political Science where security is taught. They might not have 10 professors who do that, but they might have 1 or 2. That's all you need. So that's what I would say. But it's hard to comment more without knowing more.
Thank you for your answer. I'm waiting to respond from one of the Stanford University Chase. Actually, I'm applying nearly 4 years and I'm sending the same proposal and I'm getting the negative answer. The other one, Immersion Center, Ohio State University. I lived in Columbus, Ohio 2 years. At that time, they have the opportunity, but later they have opportunity. Right now, I'm applying, but I don't know.
Okay. Well, good luck.
I will take your offer. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi there. Thank you again for your presentation. You earlier mentioned some research programs such as Mellon Mays and something like McNair, and these kind of structured fellowship programs. And as far as I understand, these programs can be competitive, and obviously not everyone can participate. And students are kind of led down the path of individually asking for these mentorships. I was wondering if you could speak on possibly how you can set yourself apart in this kind of individual cesspool at a competitive university, and how you would go about that, whether it's an email or how you would approach a professor or etc. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, if I were you, you could, you know, I think many people realize that there's a lot of talent at the community college level that is not fully, that is untapped or that is not channeled toward the proper resources. So you could, like, I would say maybe email faculty at some, like if you're in LA, you could email UCSD or UCLA, reach out to them and see, we would like to have someone from Mellon Mays who will come to talk to us about how to join your program. Can you come to give a presentation? Like, just like David wrote to me and said, do you want to spend an hour of your time on Saturday to do this? Of course, I said yes. So you could maybe do it that way and then get, you know, me, I know that this year I wrote a couple of letters of recommendation. They were for undergrads who took my class last spring and who are now, you know, working for me as research assistant. So I think the secret is basically you take a class with someone who you think will be a good professor, and then you approach them, and by talking to them, you try to figure out what are the channels that are available to you. Maybe some of those professors are active. You know, it's difficult, I mean, because community college teachers, they teach a lot. So it's true that it's often difficult for them. Or you can also reach through the American Sociological Association has created now they have a whole program to reach out to community college professors. So you could write directly to them. I'll tell you the name of the person who takes care of this at the ASA. I'll email it to David at the end so that you have it. So you could have same conversation we're having now, you could have it with her. Margaret Vutillo. If you look at the website of the American Sociological Association under staff, her name is Margaret Vutillo, and she's the person in charge of, she's the liaison with the community colleges. And describe to her your question, and she may be able to even like do a session with you like that, you know. She's a very nice person, and tell her that I suggested that you reach out. It might help.